Welcome to the Do No Harm podcast, where we discuss the battle to keep politics out of medicine. With our hosts, Dr. Marilyn Singleton and Do No Harm's founder, Dr. Stanley Goldfarb. Together, we're talking with people to create a better healthcare system for all, one that's based on medicine, not division.
What happens when a former teacher and a mother of two takes on a local school board? Our guest today can tell us because that's exactly what she did. Lindsay Bednar is a former teacher and a mother of two young students in one of the largest school districts in Minnesota. Over the past year, Lindsay started hearing that schools in the district were pushing unwanted ideologies onto students at all levels, from elementary to high school. All of them traced back to DEI initiatives that were overstepping boundaries and breaking trust with parents. But Lindsay knew she had to speak up. She addressed members of the Anoka-Hennepin School Board at its October meeting, just a few weeks before the school board election. And working with other local concerned parents, Lindsay and the Parents Alliance worked to flip 2 seats in the school board election. Lindsay Bednar is a living example of see something, say something, and what I like to say, putting the act in activism. Welcome to the show, Lindsay Bednar.
Oh, thank you so much for that warm welcome. That's amazing. Appreciate it and happy to be here.
Oh, well, I'm so glad. And for all of you out there, this is Dr. Marilyn Singleton, and I'm just going to get started. I'm going to ask you just sort of a general question that seemed to lead into schools thinking that they had to teach students, what do they call, social emotional learning. It's like something seems to be wrong with society these days. There's nastiness and crime and social media and texting and nobody talking face to face. Is this what schools think they have to deal with? What's going on in schools?
Yeah, great question. Well, my teaching experience was predominantly in alternative schools. And so I was with students who were at risk of not graduating, typically because of being behind in school from things outside of the school system. So they might have had a home environment where there was substance abuse or myriad of things. But what I saw in my in my teaching career was that the makeup of schools are different than when I was younger. There are a lot more students that are diagnosed with ADD, ADHD. We have students with mental health issues at a high level that we haven't seen in years prior. And there's so many factors that contribute to it. A lack of a solid home environment for sure, but also endocrine disruptors in our foods and our products. So many things that mess with our hormones. I did my capstone on it when I got my master's on social emotional learning and why it's important. I came with the lens of what I was seeing in the classroom, and for so many students, what started as social emotional learning is fantastic. It is teaching personal accountability. It is getting them to look at their decision making and seeing if they would have made a different choice, how they could have been more empowered. SEL is different from what I saw it start as. And I'm also seeing it from the lens of now a parent whose kiddos do not need to learn these things at school because we have a solid home life. So for parents who are just trying to understand what social emotional learning is, if this is something that you know you have a good relationship with your kids and you talk about things at home and they have a solid foundation, for those parents, I can understand the confusion as to why it exists in the school. From an educator's perspective, I can tell you that there are a number of students who very much need it. The issue is the ideologies that have started to saturate social emotional learning.
Lindsay, welcome. I'm Stan Goldfarb, the chairman of Do No Harm, and it's great to have you with us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you came to sort of become an activist in all this? You obviously, as an educator, you had a lot of insight into what was going on, but what flipped the switch? What made you decide to be an activist? What happened?
I really saw what started as what I believed to be well-intended educators and various professionals in the school environment wanting to create safe space for students. What has shifted into really this promotion of ideology. When I had my first teaching position, this was when the safe space stickers just started becoming popular that I knew of, where if you put it in your classroom, a student who was gay would know that this was a safe place that they could be in. And I believed in that. You know, I felt that I had been in spaces before when I was in school myself where I knew there were kids who were teased for their sexuality. And so I wanted to put that in my classroom. And it seemed to be a time where students just needed a place where they felt safe within the school environment. By the end of my teaching career in 2020, it went from what I saw GSA becoming, GSA started from a place where students really sought out an extracurricular to feel safe to a place where kids who didn't feel they belonged and were woefully confused could find their tribe. Most, if not all, of our students that were part of GSA would have any kind of comorbidity, mental health marker. And so I was starting to see this trend of social contagion. In addition to that, it was starting to, once I started to see conversations of it in other classrooms where it wasn't just extracurricular. Once I left teaching, I really started to see these gender ideology discussions of the LGBTQ umbrella happen in just the regular academic courses as opposed to in extracurriculars. And that's when I started asking more questions. We also had a number of parents as well as a few teachers come forward and say that there were conversations where students were being asked about their preferred pronouns in a classroom. And we actually had one of the parents saved the worksheet. It said, "What is your preferred pronoun?" And then underneath it, it asked, "What pronoun would you like us to use with your parent?" So they were already insinuating there is this disconnect or wedge they were putting between what they were going to call the student at school and what they were going to call the student when communicating with the parent. And as soon as I saw that line being drawn and that overreach, that's when I really started to get involved.
So as far as you're concerned, that really was the trigger. This, once you identified that they were separating the parents from the children. Is there any legal ramifications in your state about this? Is this allowed? I know in some states they've sort of said that if a parent doesn't support their children in gender affirmation, this becomes a kind of child abuse. What's the situation in Minnesota vis-a-vis this?
Well, Minnesota leans far more toward protecting, because trans people are part of the protected class. Our state leans far more to protecting the rights of anybody who identifies as transgender. But our school district does have a policy that explicitly says if a student wants to go by a name, an identity other than the birth certificate, it does require a parent-student administration conversation. That was very clear in our district policies, and we found multiple instances of those being violated.
Interesting. So,
well, okay, Stan, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, so you decided to act, which is different from simply recognizing the problem. And your actions, I guess, started with your address to the school board. Was that the moment that you sort of came out as an activist, or were there other activities that you were engaged in before that? Because what I'm trying to get at is some advice for parents that are confronting these sorts of things in their own school districts in other states. So tell us how that went and how you actually start going from understanding and appreciating the problem to acting on it.
Yeah, great question. So the first thing was really there were a group of us parents that were trading stories. You know, here's a worksheet my kid got in class. Here is, I think that the first situation was in our elementary school. There was a student who said there was a girl in our bathroom today. And so after doing some digging, we found that this girl who is in third grade identifies as a boy and has been allowed to use the boys' restroom. This was done so without any communication to other parents. That was the precipice of the conversation that started to include a lot of parents, because this wasn't, you know, we've heard of this happening in high schools or middle schools. This was elementary school. So naturally, these kids started having a lot of questions and were very curious. And so we really started with a group message thread, bouncing ideas off of one another as what can we do about this? And, you know, I always like to just reiterate, this is about the student who is identifying as transgender's safety as much as it is about any other kid. We are interested in the safety of all students. But when you are favoring the comfort of one student at the expense of the comfort and potential safety of all the other students, that doesn't land well with most parents. So that for us was just a clear violation of comfort and safety. And so we started digging into it. There is a parent alliance group here in our district. We have a Facebook page dedicated to where parents and teachers can voice their opinions, their concerns, really just share what they see going on. What their kids are saying is happening at school. We have teachers that have been sharing things, sometimes anonymously, sometimes coming forward and saying, hey, this is actually happening, and I don't quite know what to do about it. I will say, because of my background, I think, more comfortable than most to come forward. Anybody who knows me knows I have been an advocate for kids in the LGBTQ umbrella. And so I wasn't concerned about being labeled a bigot or a transphobe or a homophobe or any of those things that people are fearful of getting labeled. And so I feel like I did have that on my side. People knew that I wasn't doing this out of hatred. And I think that gave me the confidence to speak out and move forward. But what I want everybody to understand is once I did that, the overwhelming positive response I got was far greater than I could have imagined. I only had a few people push back, and even the pushback was respectful, and it was more of a dialogue than anything else. These are concerns shared by most all parents, and so many of us are so afraid to speak up because we are afraid of being labeled. But I can assure you, my experience has shown this is a very wide-held concern for parents and teachers.
This is so good to hear, because sometimes it seems like only the loudest negative voice gets the press or gets people talking. And what you're saying is, it sounds like you're in the majority, but the famous silent majority, and we're so glad you didn't get silent anymore. I have to ask you, since you're in Minnesota, the home of the BLM protests and riots and whatnot. How do parents feel about some of the teaching along these racial lines of, labeling white people as oppressors and brown-skinned people as the oppressed? And it's hard to imagine that parents would like their children to be considered victims. What are parents saying to you?
Everybody that I've connected with is absolutely had it with DEI, because you're absolutely right. It is, and just as I shared at the school board, the vast majority of us know it to be condescending and extremely divisive. When you pin any particular group as an oppressor or as oppressed, you're doing what we've told children not to do since the beginning of time, which is to stereotype, which is to class based by the actions of a few. And sure, you can talk about the history of certain structures and how some feel some have been, go into the history of all that. But the reality is we are living in a time that is not the way it was 30 years ago. And when we continue teaching children that there are oppressors and there are the victims, we're just furthering the divide. And I have to say, my previous student, I had many of my students reach out to me after my video went viral. And one of my students who I'm still close with, a Black student from St. Paul, who was one of my just buddies it was Multicultural Indigenous Academy. He sent me a message afterwards, and I would love to share it with your audience so that they know this isn't coming from white people in suburbia. This is coming from a Black student who lives in inner city St. Paul, and I would love to share his perspective.
Well, please do. I'm sure everybody would want to hear this.
It starts out, "Yo, that's so awesome. I'm so for sticking it to the leftist media mob. The psychological detriment caused by the indoctrination of today's youth is gross. Coupled with the notion of minorities being victims is actually ridiculous when thought about in a rational sense. Kids have and will always continue to be impressionable. To have such a level of influence over the youth will certainly cause problems for the nation. We can see that as it's evident now. I love that you have the courage to speak on the subject, as most people don't have the heart due to societal pressure. You are a true gem, Sensei." So that was his message.
Oh my goodness, that is enough to bring tears to your eyes. How old was this student?
So he is now a father. He is in his late 20s. I was impressed, not just his perspective, but the way he articulated it. Being his English teacher, that was a pretty proud moment for me to receive that message.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
So, Lindsay, just to sort of finish up here, so let's say you're a parent in, let's say, someplace in Indiana or somewhere else in our wonderful country, and you're confronted with some of these issues that you suddenly become aware of for your kids in school. What are the resources that a parent can look to as a way that they can make an impact like you have, or at least start to alert their local school boards and other parents about this? Are there resources that you use that you would recommend for others who are in the same sort of position that you were when this all started?
Yeah, great question. Well, first I would encourage them to connect with as many like-minded parents as they can. It really started with a small group of us, and then somebody would add somebody to the group, and somebody else would say, "Hey, I spoke with somebody else about this. Can I invite them to join our chat?" And pretty soon our text thread got really large, and then it grew from there. So don't be afraid to start small, and then ask the people around you to start kind of getting interest from others. We also looked into the the social emotional learning guides and tools that were being given to the district. And so those should be made readily available upon request. Anything that is being used in the classroom should be available to parents. If you know a teacher in the district that has your same concerns, it's great to have conversation with them and get their perspective as well. Sometimes they know of things going on behind the scenes that parents don't. And so we've had some of those conversations. I guess the last thing I would say is connect with me. I'm happy to just talk with anybody about what it is we did, what we found worked. I didn't go to the school board thinking that my 2-minute talk a difference in what they plan to do. I went to the school board so that I could grab a video clip that we could share on our Facebook groups in hopes of having more people see it, maybe have them consider our perspective, and also so that people would know they weren't alone. I never anticipated it being picked up by the Daily Mail and going viral, but it just is proof that you have no idea how much your message and your bravery can mean to people until you step out and do it.
That's great. So how can people reach you then? That's the obvious question.
Sure. I'm probably most active on Instagram. My handle is L Bednar, so L for Lindsay and Bednar. And they can just send me a direct message, and yeah, I'm happy to share any resources that we have and just walk through some of the steps that we took really to grow this network. I'm so fortunate to have been connected with your Do No Harm organization. And the more that we can share resources and everybody can connect together, the more this movement's really going to take shape and we can get back to academics and education.
Thank you so much for this information, and thank you for coming on the program and sharing it. I just wish we had more people who were so courageous like you out there in the schools and just out there in public. So thank you for coming on the show.
I'm not somebody who is ever comfortable with public speaking or putting myself out there, but I promise you what comes back from it is worth it. So I encourage everyone to do the same.
Okay, thank you so much again. And I'd like to thank everyone for listening. And thank you for supporting our efforts to protect patients and doctors and healthcare itself from divisive ideology. Please visit us at donoharmmedicine.org. And thanks again for listening.